started or goes back to my husband, who's an archaeologist and does field work during the summers in Guatemala. So I went down to visit him 1 year, and while I was down there, we traveled to Belize and met cacao growers and people that were working with chocolate, and it just seemed like such a cool thing. At the time I was working in economic development and I had a background in anthropology, so especially the sourcing side of chocolate making and meeting cacao growers, that was particularly interesting to me, and it felt like it just brought together so many things that I'd been interested in for a long time. That was a lot of trial and error. Most of it, which was fun. It was fun, particularly for pinpointing the percentages of the chocolate that I was making and deciding whether to make something, 70% or 72%, and trying different amounts of sugar, different roast profiles. I have smaller equipment, kind of test equipment that I can use to play around with recipes, so I did a lot of experimentation. Definitely the hardest part was probably getting the initial roast profiles for the cocoa beans. Once I had the roast profiles for the most part down, it was easier to just play around with the sugar content or the other ingredients that I was adding. So it's a fun process. New Orleans is just a city that I've loved ever since I moved here. My husband and I have been living here for about 6 years now, and it's such this amazing food city, of course, and then the amount of diversity, culturally speaking. It's just, there's always something going on here, and that combination of things made it feel especially exciting. In particular because at the time I wasn't aware of anybody that was making chocolate from cocoa beans in Louisiana, so it was just providing something that wasn't here yet. So it just felt like a great combination. The first thing that I do is sourcing. So I go down to meet cacao growers. That was something I did before I even started buying cocoa beans from the cooperative that I buy all of my cacao from now. I went down and visited the cooperative called Noradino in Peru and got to taste the different cacao origins because it's a fairly large cooperative that I work with, and so they buy cocoa beans from farmers throughout northern Peru. And so went down and was able to taste the different origins, visit the community of El Platanal, and talk with the farmers about their fermentation and drying practices and the things that they do at origin, and just put a little bit of a face to the origin for me as well. And so the first thing I do is sourcing. Once I buy cocoa beans and bring them up to the US, they've been fermented and dried, but they're raw. So the first stage of the chocolate making process is I sort through the cocoa beans, pull anything out that's not a cocoa bean, pieces of jute bag, anything like that, pull out any that have germinated already or are shriveled and flat, or just anything that wouldn't contribute a good flavor to the chocolate. And then roasting is the next step, and that helps the cocoa beans detach from their husk. It develops the flavor compounds that we associate with chocolate, and after I roast, I do what's called cracking and winnowing, where you break the cocoa beans into pieces of the bean itself, or nib, and the husk that surrounds the cocoa bean, and you remove the husk and just use the nib for the chocolate making process. So the next stage is grinding, and that's definitely the longest stage of the process. It's about 4 days for me to go from bean to bar, and 3 days of that are running the grinders, and that they have these large stone wheels that reduce the particle size of the cocoa beans, and since cocoa beans are about 50 to 55% fat content, they liquefy under the pressure and the heat generated by the stones. So that's the stage where I also add in sugar and milk powder if I'm using milk. And once that machine has run for about 3 days, I remove the liquid chocolate. It should be super fine. You shouldn't be able to feel any particles, just completely fluid. And it should also have the taste that I'm looking for, because there are a lot of flavor changes that happen during that process. And then the final stage is called tempering, which is raising and lowering the temperature of the liquid chocolate so that the cocoa butter crystallizes into the structure that you want it to. If you don't temper chocolate and just let it solidify at room temperature, the cocoa butter will crystallize at random, and so you'll end up with a grayish coating on the back of the bar. It'll kind of crumble sometimes instead of snapping. It won't be shiny, melts at the wrong temperature. So there are a lot of aesthetic changes that happen during tempering, and then I mold them and remove any air bubbles, and it's the process. The biggest piece of advice I would give is to be patient with yourself and not too hard on yourself when you make mistakes, both within the chocolate making process, as you're trying to figure out roast profiles and different recipes. There can be a lot of times when you feel like, what am I doing? Doesn't taste the way I wanted it to taste. So not only during that process, but then also all of the things that go into any business. For people like me who didn't have a business background before I started this one, it's a lot to try and learn as you go, and I think that can be intimidating, and it's good to just remind yourself that you're doing it for the first time and just learn it as you do it.